This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning. I'm Deb Gerard. I'm the Executive Director for Impact Melanoma, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcam this morning as part of our regular series of our melanoma symposiums, which we've been working on for the last 12 years. But as Impact has grown and taken a new national presence over the last couple of years, we've decided that the best way for us to reach everyone out there that is interested in getting our information, that we are going to use webcam. So this is how it's going to work this morning. I'm going to introduce you to our three wonderful speakers, and they will each take their turn, and we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions either after the person has spoken or at the end of the session, and just type your questions in chat, and we will be working from that. Also with me this morning is Annette Quinn, who's our Manager for Support Services here at Impact Melanoma. So I'd like to welcome all of our speakers this morning. We're going to try to have a sort of informal opportunity for you to see all of us, and if you have questions, please make sure you type them in for us. So I'd like to, again, welcome you to Strategies and Support for Dealing with the Death of a Loved One. As many of you who have been with us in prior symposiums, you know that this is not a typical workshop for us, but it's also something that we've been asked by many of you who attend our symposiums regularly to address. And so we're going to address it in a very strategic way. I'm going to introduce you to these presenters. First, I'm very excited to have Sue Morris join us this morning. Sue is the Director of Bereavement Services at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Sue will serve as a facilitator for this as well. Sue is the Director of Bereavement. She also oversees the Bereavement Task Force at Boston Children's Hospital and is a member of the Roberts Program on Sudden Unexplained Death in Pediatrics. Sue studied clinical psychology, specializing in adult mental health and cognitive behavioral therapy. She's worked in bereavement for many years, both in Sydney and in Boston, and is currently the author of a book entitled Overcoming Grief and an Introduction to Coping with Grief, published in London by Counsellor Robinson. So I'd like to introduce Sue. Next, after Sue's presentation, you'll hear from Tracy Coghram. Tracy is Impact Melanoma board member and has also lost a loved one, her son Connor. So you will hear some from Tracy. Tracy spent her career developing marketing and research strategies for Fortune 100 companies. She most recently served as Vice President of Global Customer Experience for Federal Mongol Corp. In 2013, Tracy left her corporate role when her 20-year-old son Connor was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. Connor was diagnosed November 1st of that year and passed away 2 months and 9 days later on January 9th, 2014. Tracy has been a volunteer and advocate for several cancer-related organizations during her entire adult life. But after Connor's passing, she devoted all of her time to fundraising and advocating for the prevention and education of melanoma. She's been a board member for Impact, formerly Melanoma Foundation New England, since August of 2014. She and her husband, Scott Bohoffer, formed their own nonprofit organization based in Santa Cruz, California, where they raised funds to support UCSF's Melanoma Research Lab, as Tracy developed a strong relationship with UCSF during Connor's illness. Tracy spends her free time, I don't think she has any, writing and running, but mostly enjoys spending time with her family and Connor's wonderful friends. She often says, when a parent has a child, their worst fear is that something will happen to that child. When a parent loses a child, Their worst fear is that their child will be forgotten. Connor has not been forgotten. And third, you will hear from Margaret Mcewen. Margaret defines herself as a caregiver. Married for over 40 years, Margaret was the primary caregiver for her husband, John Mcewen, who lived with stage 4 metastatic melanoma for 5 years. As a couple, they loved to spend time together with their family of 3 married children and 6 grandchildren. They traveled as often as they could internationally and would go on annual family vacations to Walt Disney World. Margaret holds a bachelor's degree in science and a master's degree in food and nutrition. As a registered dietitian, she was a trailblazer in the field of supermarket retail dietetics. She retired from Shaw Supermarket as Vice President of Corporate Communication. Margaret continues to enjoy spending time with her family, traveling and volunteering for a community ministry that provides hope to families in need. Much of her creative free time is spent quilting and embroidering household items and decorative art. Every Day is a Gift, A Couple's Guide to Cancer Journey, is her first published work. Her goal in sharing their story is to offer others hope as they face similar challenges. As you can hear, we have a very varied and wonderful group of presenters this morning. So feel free to sit back and listen and type your questions as often and as much as you'd like. So now, Sue, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, thanks, Deb, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here today, and we'll be going through some slides that outline my talk. So I'll be talking about bereavement from a more of a psychological perspective, and I just have to show you first, I have a disclosure about my self-help books that I have. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about grief and help people who may be in the early stages of their grief particularly understand what their experience may be like. I'll talk also about what helps when you're grieving, as well as thinking about preparing for the holidays or other firsts, especially with Thanksgiving just around the corner. We'll spend a little bit of time on resources, what are out there to help people, and then the signs that we think about are important for when you may need to get some extra professional help. So as far as my introduction, as Deb said, I'm the Director of Bereavement Services at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. I'm a clinical psychologist and the author of those 2 self-help books. I'm passionate about bereavement and have worked in this area for about 20 plus years now between Sydney, which is where I'm originally from, just in case you can't tell, and Boston. And I've been at Dana-Farber for about 9 years. So, when I think about the work I do and trying to raise awareness about bereavement, I kind of think about in our Western society, we don't do a very good job at supporting bereaved individuals. I think in the beginning, people, rally around, but soon after everybody's life goes back to normal, which is kind of expected, but bereaved individuals can feel then more isolated and alone. So part of what my work is involved is how do we raise awareness, raise the standard of care for bereaved individuals. And I think, certainly in Western society, there is we like to fix things, and this is something, we can't do. And I think I learned very early on, probably back in grad school in Sydney, that, when I first became interested in bereavement, that you can't fix a bereaved person's problem. It's not possible, and there's sometimes then a little bit of a disconnect in our society because people want to fix you. But rather, throughout the course of my career, I kind of aim to help the bereaved take control of their grief rather than letting their grief consume or overwhelm them. Particularly, I like to think of my approach as a toolbox approach, where we want to put in different tools that people can pick and choose at different times to help them. And these tools are really strategies to help to help bereaved people, especially when grief is new in those early months. So just to think about grief, as I said, from a psychological perspective, and this is a definition that I particularly like, that grief is defined as the anguish experienced after the death of a significant loved one. And, I think the word anguish can capture some of the experience, even though I always say to my bereaved individuals in groups that we don't have enough words in the English language to really adequately describe the experience of grief. And that is something you may struggle with as you are grieving, as to how do you really sum up what your experience is. But we think of grief as being characterised not only by deep sadness, but yearning, or I think in Australian English, I would say pining or longing. You really yearn or long for the person who is no longer here. And there's something very physical about that. It's a real, we could think of it as a primitive response, and it's got a lot to do with how attached we are to the person who died. There's intense physical and emotional reactions, and I think most people think that grief is very emotionally challenging, but it's also physically challenging, which is why I always stress to my bereaved family members, to make sure you think about how depleted you may feel, and you may just need to always check in with your local doctor. And even though grief is very painful, I think we often forget that it's actually a normal response to loss. So there again is that it's very, very painful. We can't fix it, but it is normal. And think about it as a period of adjustment. Again, this is from that psychological perspective, that people have to, when somebody they love dies, adjust to the absence of that person from their life. And that involves a lot of change. And for some people, the change will be far greater than for others. So we always think about adjustment and change. And that grief then follows a wave-like pattern, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few more slides. But again, as I said at the beginning, we really want to think about it in the context of our society, which, for us at the moment, especially now more than ever, is we live in a very technology-driven society where we think everything happens immediately. You send an email, you expect a response within hours. You send a text, and I often ask people what's the etiquette on a text, getting a return text, and probably the answer is the younger you are, the faster you expect a text. But so we live in this world that's very technology driven, it's fast paced, we think we have a sense of control, very task focused, and again, as I mentioned, we have this fix-it mentality. And it is very common when I meet bereaved people for the first time that they come in and they say something like, I thought I'd be better by now. And it may be a few months after the death, or it could even be a matter of weeks after the death. There's something that they express as though they thought they'd be kind of over it, or they'd be better in much the same way they would recover from, a cold. And I think they're sometimes surprised by that. So this next slide shows you how I draw this for people, is that often people think that their progress will be this nice linear, straight line that goes from the left-hand side where the death occurs, that as time goes on, you will expect that you will just be getting better and better and better in this nice linear fashion. And I say, well, this is a really inaccurate model for grief, even though I think the expectation is that often people think it of themselves, and maybe those who are supporting you might think that, gee, it's 3 months now or 6 months now, that I should be kind of getting better, but really 6 months later, maybe when it coincides, for example, with the holidays or a significant anniversary. So this is a really good model for an ear infection or a cold, but it's not a good model for grief. And so I try to help people understand that we think of it as much better model is to think about waves. And whilst this is a simplistic drawing on the screen now, grief does come in waves, and the waves for most people usually are larger in the beginning, even if the death was expected, and then the waves lessen over time and they become less intense, and maybe the frequency lessens as well. You can see that I've drawn one trigger wave there, as I call them. They're triggers that actually correlate with a heightened emotion again, and there could be many on that, I just haven't drawn them. And if I could extend the wave, I would also make the wave get a little larger again as you get closer to the first anniversary. And people often will say, gee, this time last year we were doing this, or this time last year this was happening. But even though this is simplistic, it's really important to know that it's not the straight line, but it's much more a wave-like process. And if you look at this next one, this, is also a common wave that I see, where the waves may get stronger a little bit further down the track. And this sometimes happens when, for example, people may have to go back to work straight away, so they're distracted by their work, or they may have a young child at home or young children who need your attention, that often the wave doesn't get stronger until a little bit later. Either way, this is just a generalization. It's a good representation. It's very helpful too to think about people in different families, or different members of the same family who are all grieving the same person. You will have different waves. That everyone's experience is going to be unique because you will have different triggers. So just think about as grief comes in waves, and it's often talked about in the literature that is people's experience. So as I mentioned, grief is about adjusting to the loss of someone physically from your life, and I always want to think about change. How much does somebody's life change after the death of a loved one? And even if you're, in your 80s, for example, and your partner may have died, often people will be trying to fix you by saying, well, you're lucky that you had them for as long as you had them, for example, but that's trying to, the fixing. Whereas I think much more about the change. How much does somebody's life change? And for people who have been together for a long time, their life changes tremendously. Somebody who's lost a child, their life changes tremendously as well. So thinking of change is a really important focus in grief, because we want to help people adjust to all the different changes in their life. And after somebody dies, there's many, many changes. It's not just the one loss. You have many, many losses that you have to kind of navigate. So what does a grieving person need? If you've recently lost somebody, you may know some of these things, you may have experienced them yourselves, but these are the things that we think kind of help people, certainly in the early months, to have the death and the loss acknowledged. And as I said, people in the beginning usually are pretty good. We live in a sympathy card or a condolence card society. We send cards, we acknowledge death. But soon after, people's lives go back to normal, and people need to be able to tell their story over and over in many cases. And often there's not those opportunities as the months go on. So you have to try to find ways to where you are able to talk about not only what happened with your loved ones, maybe illness and their death, but also your own bereavement experience. What's your story about how you're managing your grief? And that's where often a counsellor can be a good support, because often people say they feel they don't want to burden their friends or family anymore, so then they keep things inside. Whereas I really believe grief is much better out. And people who are grieving also then need to be able to express their thoughts and feelings. And these change over time. And so therefore it's not just, gee, I've done it once, I can check it off. You need to be able to continue to talk about what you're thinking. And that's a way that you try to make sense of what's happened. So that's really important. So don't try to, think I shouldn't be talking about this anymore. You may need to think about, I'll find somebody who I can speak to, but you don't want to suppress it, because that unfortunately can make things worse in the end. And then finally, I suppose a grieving person needs to then build a new life without the deceased person physically present. And that takes time and effort, and I talk about it being a trial and error approach. It's not just going to be instantly. And this next diagram is a good way to think about it, that when you're with the person who died, you kind of had a vision of where your life was heading, and we're in many relationships with many different people throughout our lives. So there's many paths that we're on. But when the person who died dies, that kind of path that you were on is now no longer an option, and you're left kind of on this new path which goes off to the right-hand side there. And if your grief is very recent, your loss is very recent, you're right near the fork of the road there, and you have to think about, well, what does my new path look like without this person in my life? And that's where the change occurs. There's lots of change as you build this new path, and some of the things will be the same on the path, whether it's your job or other family members, but other things will be different, especially maybe how you think about life, your purpose in life. And you can see I have written their attachment. We grieve people we're significantly attached to, and that gets back to that yearning that I mentioned early on. Even though this again is a neat diagram, I would think that that path is probably much more, if I could draw it, with lots of twists and bumps along the road, and some potholes too. So it's not going to be just something that you can do immediately. It is a process that takes kind of a lot of time and energy. So the next thing is, what helps when you are grieving? Because I think this is one of the questions that people ask me a lot. What can I do to help myself? And I think the first thing that I say to people is, give yourself permission to grieve. And by that I mean, don't put those expectations on yourself that you should be over and done with this in a few months, or that you shouldn't be feeling the way you are, or I shouldn't be crying as much as I am. It's okay. You've got to give yourself permission that if you've loved somebody deeply, grief is not going to be over in an instant. There's some kind of mathematical equation there. And being able to give yourself permission really tackles some of those expectations in society that, things should be over and done with quickly. As I said before, you really want to tell your story and find people who can listen to you, which is why I'm a big proponent of support groups. I think that allows people to have opportunities to tell their story, and thinking that grief is better out than in. And it's not necessarily just talking about it. You can do lots of other things like writing, being creative, exercising, whatever it is, listening to music that taps into your grief. But you want to try to work out a way to get your grief out. Early on, particularly, I encourage people to establish a daily routine. And I think it's really important, especially for people who are dealing with the death of a spouse or a partner or a child, is to think about what your routine is on a weekday and also on a weekend. Because I think our society, even though we kind of can work 7 days a week now, weekends are where people spend more time with their families. So you want to think about, what's my routine through the week, and then what's my routine on the weekend where I may feel more alone because I don't want to be burdening other people. Creating a to-do list. I'm a big believer in lists. I think lists help you feel like you have a little bit more control over what's happening. And I think in the beginning you can be overwhelmed with all the administrative tasks that come with the death of a loved one. So a to-do list helps you feel a little bit more in control. You can have a list that you run, and you may only be able to do 1 or 2 things each day. And even though you may be someone who normally does 20 things a day, again, that is adjusting those expectations. So prioritize, do what you need to do that day, check it off and feel good about doing that. But having a list just helps you know that I'll get to it. Again, it helps have that kind of increase that sense of control. Plan to do something every day, and it can be very small tasks, but trying to actually get out of the house, even if it's just to go for a walk or go to the shops or meet a friend for a coffee. Planning to do something every day helps you connect with others, because grief is very isolating. And I think particularly in New England, where we're just about to face our first snowstorm for the season, we can tend to stay indoors a lot, and I think people need to work out a way to get out. So accepting invitations from friends or family, even if you don't really feel like it. I think if people wait to feel like doing things, you may not do them for a long time. So if they're with friends or family whose company you normally enjoy, I encourage people, give it yourself a little nudge, maybe accept the invitation so that you can have an exit strategy so you can leave if you need to. These are pretty standard recommendations, but eat regularly. People often feel they lose their appetite, but just eating regularly keeps up with that physical self-care, as well as limiting alcohol consumption, because we know that Sometimes people want to drink alcohol to help themselves feel better, but in the long run, it doesn't help. And then practice good self-care, and that's a huge umbrella term, but that can include things like exercise, things that you normally might have liked doing, or hobbies, something creative that helps replenish you, especially if you've been caring for the person who died for a long time. You've often put your own self-care onto the back burner. So it's important in your grief to think about the things you normally would have done, even if you haven't done them for some period of time, to gradually put things back into that, your routine. And as I said before, this is the one thing I mentioned to everybody, and some people do it and some people don't think about doing it because they don't think they need to. But I think checking in with your local doctor is a good strategy because they're aware of your other physical problems if you have physical health conditions. Just because grief is such a stressful, we call it a stressful life event, it's really important to check in with your doctor. And again, it just is then another kind of layer of support for if you may need it in the future. Well, as we said, Thanksgiving's just around the corner, so it's useful just to spend a few minutes just thinking about the holidays or other firsts, and how I encourage people to plan for the holidays. It's the same as dealing with the firsts, whether it might be a first birthday, a first anniversary. So it could even be the date the person was diagnosed. So in the first year, there's going to be lots of firsts, and depending on when your loved one died, this may be the first holiday for you. And often people will say with firsts that they feel a sense of dread. It's often a time when families and everybody's happy and they don't feel like doing that. And that may be okay because it can create also anxiety. That, the holidays, and as the holidays approach or other firsts approach, there's often the waves start to increase again in intensity, those trigger waves. Kind of rear their ugly head. So using a framework can help you to increase your sense of control. Anticipation is often worse than the day itself, so being able to develop a plan is really important. And that plan may include things like, well, who do I want to spend these holidays with this year? Who will be the people who would give me the best support? Or who would also understand if I just feel like being quiet, in a corner somewhere. So think about who it is that you want to be with. Do you want to have do the same things as you've always done? Or does this year, you want to do something different? You might decide that I don't want to do the same thing this year. I want to go to someone else's house or go away. And, knowing that whatever you do the first year, you can change it next year. It doesn't have to set it in stone. So think about rituals, the rituals and the traditions that you enjoy, and also thinking about maybe creating opportunities to remember your loved one at that time. I was only speaking to someone yesterday who said with Thanksgiving coming, they weren't sure because the person who died always had the head of the table, and they didn't know whether they wanted to keep the seat empty or have someone else sit in it. And so as a family, they're going to work out who's going to sit in that seat this year, and maybe they'll rotate it in years to come. But whatever it is that you do, it's useful to talk to the people who you would be most significant in your life. And then have realistic expectations. If you have somebody who goes all out at 150%, maybe this year you decide, I can't do all of that. And that's okay. So that's that giving yourself permission to do things differently this year. And maybe you don't do everything in the same way that you've always done. And I think what's really important with holidays or other firsts when you get together with your family and friends is to find opportunities to reminisce. We think reminiscing is a really important strategy, and these special kind of events allows you the opportunity to think about, gee, do you remember when mum or dad did this, or so-and-so did that? The fun stories as well as, what you're thankful for. So just create those opportunities as you go forward. And so now just to think about resources, this is just a few, and I've already spoken about some of these. Obviously, there's lots of self-help books available. There's lots of online material available. You can find, support groups through local hospices. I think the one thing I'd want to stress is that some people don't know that hospice bereavement programs are available to you, even if your loved one did not use that hospice. And so wherever you may live, you can check in with those local hospices to see what bereavement program support groups they may offer. Religious groups, other groups in the community offer bereavement, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of searching to see which one you think may be the best fit. There are a lot of online groups, the same thing. You have to just decide whether you think it's a good fit for you, and is it a peer-led group versus led by a professional, like a clinician. And different groups have different approaches, and they can be, you can maybe do different groups over time. Mix with friends and family with whom you're comfortable, who are going to allow you to, tell your story. As we said, check in with your local doctor. I think see a grief counsellor, even if it's only for a few sessions. Some people aren't sure whether they want to see a counsellor. But as I said, grief is normal, but it can be helpful just to have somebody who is not your family, especially if your other family members are grieving the same person. You may normally have gone to them when you've had issues or problems you're dealing with, but you may be a little reluctant if they're also grieving. So a grief counsellor, even if it's short term, it can be a great support. And if you've seen a counsellor in the past for some other issues who already know you, contacting them again may also be helpful. And then try new things. This is particularly relevant as you develop that new path. A lot of my bereaved people now are talking to me about going to meetup groups, which, if you don't know what that means or haven't heard of those, they're groups that are kind of based on different activities. You can go to a meetup group for hiking or bushwalking, that's an Australian term, sorry, bird watching, or, of food, anything. There's lots of different groups, and that way you kind of tap into your hobbies, and you may meet other people who, you can then form friendships with, in addition to like support groups for bereaved people. So when we think of barriers to working through grief, when you may need to then go and seek extra help, is if you have a lot of feelings that, you can't seem to budge, you're kind of constantly going over things in your head, and then you may be feeling particularly guilty about something, you may have regrets, or you may be angry. These can be normal feelings that people can have, but if they linger for a long time, things that you feel that you just can't budge it, that can be an indication to speak to somebody. Difficult memories, and maybe to do with around the death of your loved one, or if you've got unanswered questions. Maybe there's some questions now that they're kind of continuing to go around in your head, and you may not have thought about them for a while, but now they pop back up again. There may be things left unsaid between you and the person who died, or there may be conflict within your family, or you may find that you're avoiding certain places or people, or having difficulty making decisions. And certainly with bereavement, there are often a lot of decisions that need to be made. So these can be kind of barriers, if you want to think, that may cause that wave to kind of continue to be, strong. So in those cases, this would be when I would suggest that you might think, gee, I need to speak to somebody. And it could be a counsellor, but with unanswered questions, certainly, I often encourage people, if they feel that there's a medical question that they're not quite sure of, they may want to, go back to the medical team just to ask, gee, I kind of can't remember why we did this. Could you please clarify that for me? And that can be, helpful for people in helping them kind of understand what they're kind of worried about. So definitely, though, when we would, as clinicians, recommend that you seek professional help, is if you're feeling depressed or hopeless about your future, you're feeling as though things are getting worse, you're stuck, thinking about suicide or not being here anymore, that would be definitely something we would say you need to get help immediately. Or if you feel consumed by the death, you're finding that it's taking all your waking time, you're avoiding reminders that your loved one has died, or you're withdrawing from those who normally you would want to be around, or relying heavily on alcohol or other drugs, or having difficulty attending work, school, or other activities. I think this is very important, especially if you start to think that life isn't worth living anymore. So where to seek help? Obviously your doctor. There's grief counsellors, clinical psychologists, social workers. Sometimes even just asking other people who may have lost a loved one, did they see somebody? Because often that personal recommendation can be important. And then attending the bereavement support group, hospice or religious organisation. And you can do all of those three things. It's not an either or. And there's also, different national bodies like the Social Workers Association or the American Psychological Association. Those type of organisations often have a list of clinicians, and as would your insurance providers. So this is a very quick overview, but I think it's really, the take-home point is really to think about grief is very normal, even though it can be excruciatingly painful and isolating. And you don't want to do it alone. I believe, whilst you have to grieve, nobody can do it for you. You can have the support of other people. So just to sum up, what I would say is that grief can be a very isolating experience. So it's best to find others who can support you both professionally as well as, personally in your personal life. So thank you.
Making the switch. Thank you, Sue. That was all wonderful information, and I think that you'll see as I go through the topic that I'm discussing, you'll see some of the things that Sue talked about kind of actually put into practice here through my journey these last 5 years. So good morning. I'm Tracy Coghram, and the interesting thing about this is when Impact Melanoma invited me to be a participant in this panel, I was actually a little shocked because I thought, I'm certainly not an expert, and what do I know and what could I share that might be helpful to other people. But as I thought about the topic and looked back at my own personal journey, I realized that I did actually go through a series of steps to find things that worked for me and how to cope. And I guess I would start off by saying that the first thing that happened is I learned two key truths, that even though we might all experience this differently, the two things that I learned I think can apply to all humans who go through something like this. And the first thing that I learned is that when you go through something like this, life goes on. It goes on. Whether we want it to or not, it goes on. I expected the day that my son died for everything to just stop. How could the world continue to go on when such a joy in the world was now gone? So I was in a writing class recently, and I was describing the shock of realizing that the world didn't just stop. And this person asked me to explain a little bit more about how that felt. And the way I described it was that I used a movie that I had seen when I was in high school, and I think it might have been the first Superman movie, when somebody dies and Superman is trying to reverse time, and so he lassos the earth and he digs his heels in and he's trying to make the earth stop and turn back time to bring this person back to life. And I can remember just physically thinking, why can't I do that? Why can't I turn the world back and bring Connor back? And it's certainly a lofty goal to turn back time. It's going to happen. But it's something that took me a little while to realize that, gosh, life is really going to go on. So that was the first truth that I learned that became kind of the foundation for my survival, I guess is the word that I'll use over the next 5 years. And the second thing that I learned, and this was a little bit of a tough lesson, was that grief is very personal, and there is not one right way to grieve. In fact, there are as many different ways to grieve as there are people on earth, and you have to find your own path and your own journey. And what works for me may not work for you. But the truth is that by coming together and sharing our experiences, we at least, if nothing else, learn that we're not crazy. And that was a key thing for me to learn, because there were certainly times that I felt like I was going crazy. And then this is actually something that Sue talked about. I always say that there are two truths, but in reality there are three. And the third one that that I really didn't understand is that grief is physical. It is a physical thing. It hurts physically. Your body aches. There are times when you can't breathe. There are, you don't want to eat. I developed something that I affectionately refer to as grief brain, which means that I basically couldn't remember things. And it was more than just the fog of the first year when your body goes into shock. It was really a chemical change in my brain, and I couldn't remember things. And then the last thing that I learned about this physicality of grief is that grief is really dehydrating. So when you talk about eating and making sure you have proper nutrition, you also have to make sure that you have enough fluids in your body, because I cried for months, and I did reach a point of dehydration, and so was given advice that, you know, grief is dehydrating, and you have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself in all of those ways. So with that, kind of as a little backdrop, I wanted to share just a little bit of Connor's story. So, and I'll do the very shortened version here so we can actually talk about the strategies and coping. Connor was born in 1993 with a congenital nevi, basically just a little birthmark that was on the side of his head. It looked like a little freckle, and it was about the size of of my pinky fingernail. And I remember very vividly asking the doctor what this was, and the response that I got, I was told it's just a birthmark, no big deal. And so Connor was very fair-skinned and had red hair, and you can see I have a picture here of him on the screen, just very fair-skinned. So because of that, by the age of 4 or 5, we were seeing a dermatologist every year. And then by the age of probably, maybe 10 or 12, we were seeing a dermatologist, 2 or 3 times a year. And by 12 years old, we were finding that he was already beginning to have suspicious-looking spots removed. So anyway, we had a really close relationship with our dermatologist. And the spot on the side of his head was, certainly growing as his body grew, but nothing abnormal. And we had it checked annually. And then the second semester of his senior year of high school, he called me on the phone and said, "Mom, I just got my hair cut, and the person cutting my hair says that this spot on my head has really changed." And it was on his scalp and covered by his hair, so certainly wasn't something that we saw every day. And when I looked at it, it certainly had changed. Over a period of 3 months since his prior haircut, it had gone from being just a typical brown little freckle to this enormous black and red, irregularly shaped kind of mass on the side of his head. And so to make the story a little shorter, within 2 weeks, we were having it removed. And then within 2 months, he was declared cancer-free. We had gone through all of the biopsies and lymph node testing and all of that. He was declared cancer-free. And so we went on with our lives because, as we know, life goes on. And then right around the time we were celebrating his 18 months of being cancer-free, he said to me at dinner one night, I just don't feel very good. Can you take me to the drop-in tomorrow? And so I went with him to the drop-in, and the doctor heard his history and immediately sent us to the emergency room. And 8 hours later, we left with CDs that had full body scans that showed melanoma in every organ in his body, including his bones, and it even presented in his left eye. It was not yet in his brain or lungs, so we had still some hope for treatment, and immediately began treatment. And then 2 months and 9 days later, unfortunately, Connor succumbed to melanoma. And I will say another thing. The fourth thing that I've learned is that when you have to cry, you just let yourself cry, and that's the way it goes. So I may cry several times during this discussion. Anyway, what I'll say about that at the end of all of that is that there is nothing in the world that prepares a person to walk out of a hospital room and leave their child dead in the hospital room. There's not a playbook for that. There's not anything that tells you what to do the day after, the next minute. There's nothing. And so I've started referring to that walk as I left Connor's room. I call that my own personal green mile. I can remember looking down at the tile as I'm walking out of that hospital and thinking, this is the longest hallway I have ever walked down. And, you know, you leave the hospital and then life is continuing to go on and you have to figure out what the new you is and your new life. So I realized very quickly that there is no playbook for this. Fortunately, I thank God for the fact that the first year you're basically numb and walking around in a fog, because I don't think that my body could have at all processed that pain. It was the most incredible pain I've ever experienced. But I realized pretty early on that grief, you know, I often hear people talk about grief as a process, and maybe it is a process, I don't know. But I don't like the word process, because in my mind, it feels as though that's saying that grief has a beginning and a middle and an end. And for me, in this particular instance, my grief will never end. And so what I've learned is that it doesn't exist beside you. Grief is not something that sits beside you. It's something that you have to figure out how to incorporate into the very fabric of who you are. And when I hear people like Sue's wonderful presentation where she talked about the waves of grief and how it comes and goes and it lessens over time, I've thought a lot about that. And I believe that that's true. But I actually think that for me, it hasn't lessened. What happens is that, just as what Sue was describing, you have to define kind of the new you and what your new life means. From the time that you lose your loved one, it's almost like an exercise of you're building this muscle of your body and your emotions to be able to carry this enormous burden that you have been given that you wish you had never been given. And I think for me, when I hear people say it becomes easier over time, it's not easier. It's that I've learned how to carry it. And there are things that trigger, that unexpectedly cause a wave, and I will realize, wow, now I have to learn how to carry that part of it. And so until the day I die, I know that that's going to be an experience that I'm going to have, and it's going to be a constant growth challenge, I think, to continue to carry this burden. So with that, I thought that I would just talk about the things that I have learned over the last 5 years and how I approach them, and kind of what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think that you'll hear some similarities, and you can actually refer back to some of the things that Sue talked about, because they were, you know, very much spot on. So I kind of look at it from the beginning, the day he died, until now. And the first thing that occurred in my life was I really was lost. I had no, I couldn't even make a decision. And so I was fortunate enough to have a wonderful husband and family who made them all for me. And I can remember during that time period, my husband planned trips, concerts. It seemed like I was, you know, so busy all the time. And I don't even know that I really wanted to go to those things, but it just kept me moving. And the other thing is, during that first year, and I don't think that I did this on purpose, but when I look back at it, I'm grateful that I did it. I had signed up to run the Boston Marathon for Impact Melanoma, and I didn't after Connor passed away. Well, I had signed up to run it in his honor, and then he was re-diagnosed, and so I ended up running it in his memory. And I actually thought that I would not run it. I don't have the energy to do it. But I decided to continue, and I'm glad that I did that, because it gave me a goal. So it gave me something to get out of bed to do every day, and you know, to get to that goal, to finish that Boston Marathon. I also found during that time that I don't think that I ever really had a lot of anger. I've not experienced that anger thing that people talk about with grief. But I did feel a need to fight back, and so I joined organizations like Impact Melanoma and others to raise money for research to fight this awful disease. I worked to help people to understand that it's a preventable disease, and it was, and you can do that for, it doesn't matter if your loved one died from melanoma or in a car accident. There's all kinds of awareness that you can bring to people to help other people not have the same experiences that you've had. And so that gave me a feeling of power, I think, in a situation where I felt like I had no control. I felt like I was just a piece of dust kind of floating in the wind, but this gave me something to really fight for. And then all of those things that I did in Connor's memory, and just saying his name, I think, was therapy enough. In some cases, I found that people, when someone dies, people are afraid to say their name because they might hurt your feelings, or they don't want to bring up anything that might make you cry or be upsetting. But for me, and I think for many of the people that I interact with now, saying their names is so important. So I said his name, and I say his name every day, and I hope that we'll continue to do that. So from a strategy perspective, that family support and certainly that friend support, and I found that from a friendship standpoint, I lost friends who I think were not able to become comfortable with the fact, about how to be around me in my grief, and that was okay. I also gained friendships that completely unexpected friendships, and found support in places from people that I had never even met, prior to Connor's death. So, opening yourself up for those relationships, I think, is incredibly important, and certainly was something that helped me. And then in Sue's presentation, she mentioned therapy several times, and I have tried them all. So I'll just go through some of the things that I did, and when they worked and when they didn't. And I think that's really key to understand, because it's a lifelong journey. What worked for me the first month may not ever work for me again, and so I have to constantly be finding those tools that work for me at the place where I am in my journey. So I began actually in online groups that I found through Facebook, and this was so incredibly important for me in particular, because nobody understood what melanoma was. When I would tell people that my son died from melanoma, they would say, skin cancer? How do you die from skin cancer? And so I found in online forums, I found other moms and dads and, siblings, people who had lost their loved ones to melanoma. And it was a place that we could actually really talk about the ugliness of this disease that nobody else in our communities really understood. And that really, really did work for me. During those first 12 weeks, I also tried hospice. I was not interested at all in any kind of group therapy at the time. I didn't want to be in a group. I wanted to speak to people, to someone individually. And the reason for that, again, was because nobody really understood melanoma, and I just couldn't see myself sitting in a group with people who just didn't understand melanoma. Not that melanoma is worse than any other death, they're all horrible, but I just had a need for people to understand what this was. So I also, during the first 12 weeks, went to hospice. It's just so incredibly wonderful, and they offered, in my area, they offered 12-week group programs, and then they also offered individual one-on-one counseling. And you could go for one session, or you could go for 12 sessions. It didn't matter. You went according to your schedule. And I think I went to about 4 of those. And they were so incredibly helpful. If for no other reason, it gave me a place to go and just cry. And sometimes I literally would sit there for the whole hour and not be able to get a single coherent word out and just cry. And that's the thing that's just so wonderful about hospice and those wonderful caring people there. there's also, so I did that. I did that. I didn't go the whole 12 weeks. I probably went to 4 or 5 sessions, and then I had not used hospice again until recently when I reached out, and I found that they have some really wonderful groups now that involve writing. So writing down your grief, and things like that. So I think I'm now at the point in my journey where those kinds of opportunities will be very beneficial. I also have, in my area, we've got a pretty large Compassionate Friends group, and I personally know many people who have gone to those groups and who really benefit. I think they're a wonderful organization. I just haven't had the opportunity to join that group yet, but it's certainly on my list and something that I think that I will do over time. And then for me, and this was really important, I tried all kinds of different therapists, individual therapists during that first year. And what I found was that I didn't want to talk to a therapist. I think this is probably quirky just for me, but I found that I didn't want to talk to a therapist if they hadn't personally lost a child or if they didn't know my son. So Santa Cruz is I'm from Santa Cruz, California, and it's a fairly small community, and I found a therapist who knew my son. And actually, I think I saw this therapist for probably 2 or 3 years, maybe sometimes twice a month and sometimes, once a quarter. But just having somebody who knew him, and sometimes I would go to him and we wouldn't talk about Connor at all. We would talk about, something completely off topic. But just being with somebody who knew Connor was such a great help for me during that time. So I also talked about the fighting back already through fundraising and education. That was something that gave me, made me feel like I had some sort of power and I wasn't just being pushed around. And then I have some other very tactical things that worked for me that will fall into buckets that Sue described earlier. And the first one that I'll start with is this notion of exercise. And when I started thinking about what I would say during this time, during this webinar, I decided just to be raw and tell the truth, because I think that's really important. And so I'm just going to be completely open on this one. So after Connor died, I ran the Boston Marathon, and I had several friends who were avid runners, one of whom lost her own son. And she didn't start running until after he died, and she got a lot of therapy out of this running. I ran before Connor got sick, and after he died, I felt as though, running just was not working for me. So I made it through that Boston Marathon, and I just really wanted to quit running. During the second year, so I didn't do much exercise after that. During the second year after Connor passed away, I went through a very short period of time, thankfully, where I decided that martinis at 10 o'clock in the morning were the right thing to do. And boy, did they taste good, and they numbed a lot of things. And so between, like 10 a.m. and maybe 3 p.m., I might have 3 martinis. And I did that for a period of 3 weeks. And I didn't hide it from anyone. My husband knew that I was doing it. And because he's such a wonderful support person, he never said a word. And then on about the end of week 3, I don't know what happened, but I'm thankful for it. I decided that this therapy was not working for me. And for the first time in my life, I could really see how somebody, after experiencing such a traumatic event, could crawl into bed and curl up with a bottle of something and just never get out of bed again. I could really understand how that could happen to a person, and I just decided that I was not going to be that person. So I decided that day that I would do some kind of exercise every day, even if it just was walking the dog or walking down to check the mail, whatever, it didn't matter. I was going to move my body in one way or another every single day. And since that day, and that was 3.5 years ago, I probably missed, 20 days of exercise And I've done everything from going back to running. I still run marathons for charities. I run, for the Boston Marathon for Impact Melanoma. I have a wonderful support group in California, a group of women who we call ourselves the Social Runners Club, and we're not competitive runners. We just go out to support each other emotionally and get our exercise, and it's just been wonderful. I also started hiking, climbed mountains. I hiked the Camino de Santiago. I did all 500 miles of that. I just did anything that I could to keep my body moving this last 3.5 years. And I believe truly that exercise saved my life. I don't know how I could have, I think I would have continued to spiral down that martini path had I not, come to that realization. So another strategy that has, or tactic really, that has really worked for me is from the beginning of Connor's illness, I wrote, I journaled, and I just, just a way to get my feelings down on a piece of paper. And I continue to do that. I keep a journal. I carry it with me wherever I go. If I don't have one, I use a napkin that's at the dinner table, if I have a thought. I blog occasionally. I've gone to grief writing retreats that have been incredibly wonderful, and I've formed friendships at those writing retreats that mean more to me than I can even describe. And in these writing retreats, we all come from different backgrounds and have different types of grief. But that doesn't matter at this point in my journey. We don't have to share all the same grief. The point is that we can support each other through them and create a safe environment to be as honest as we can. And that has been incredibly helpful for me. Another thing that has really worked is having, I call it just my quiet time. There are times where I can't wait for my husband and my stepson to be out of the house so that I can just sit down and think about Connor. And I do it still today. We're almost at 5 years now, and it's that quiet time where I can sit and I can just feel him with me. And I think that that's so important to have that time. I also spend a lot of time going to places where Connor used to be. So as an example, and this, I think people must think that this is such a strange thing to do, but I've done it literally since the day he died. And an example is on the way home after that long, horrible walk down the hallway, we arrived back to my home in my area at about 6 a.m. And we passed a Starbucks that for 8 years Connor and I would stop at and have a coffee before I would take him to school. And I had to stop there. And I stopped, and I'm sure if the people in Starbucks knew that my son had just died and I'm stopping for a latte, they would think that I'm crazy. But that being there and ordering that coffee and being there, and I could picture Connor being in that space and kind of feel him there. And so I continue to do those things, going to the places that were his favorite places when he was a child. I go and visit his favorite place at the beach where he and his friends used to hang out when they would leave campus at lunchtime. Those things just are so incredibly important to me and clearly help me every single day. And then Sue, I have 2 more things and then I'll be able to wrap it up. But Sue talked about this making a plan. And this is incredibly important. I have a plan for every key date. So whether it be the day he was diagnosed or Christmas or Mother's Day, I have a plan. I plan it. I have my Mother's Day plan already for next year. I know exactly what I'm going to do. I have the plan already for the day he died. I know what we're going to do. So I have to have it written down, and here's what I'm going to do in order to get through the day. But the feedback that I would give you about that is that getting through the day doesn't mean that you get a pass on the sadness. So you get through that day for sure, but you still have to cope with that grief. So there are no free passes, but having the plan makes it easier, and having that support makes it easier to get through. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is this one, certainly is very specific to me and my relationship with Connor. Connor was my only child, and he had an amazing group of friends who support me every single day. There is not a day that goes by that I don't hear from them, whether it's a text or a phone call or an email. And that was something that I didn't plan, but I feel incredibly grateful for, and it's something, those friendships are certainly something that I continue to cultivate as a part of my journey, getting through each day without Connor in my life. So those are a few of the strategies that have worked for me. If I had to leave you with one thing, I would say, well, two things. Surround yourself with the right people who support you and can accept the process that you have to go through, and then keep your body moving. And so that's it. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to
Here's a slide. This was your slide that I wanted to make sure that we showed because it's such a neat picture. Beautiful pictures. Good morning. My name is Margaret Mcewen. I'm just so deeply moved by Tracy's presentation. Bereavement is certainly a journey, and we are sharing a path that none of us wanted to take. It's a trip nobody wanted to be on. But we all die, and we have to accept the fact that it will happen to both us and to those we love. And so to try to create a path in our lives of how we can move along this journey and help others who are on the same path is incredibly important, and has become much more important to me as time has gone along. I really appreciate the Impact Melanoma inviting me to participate in the presentation today. I'm truly humbled by it. I don't think any one of us feels as though our story is unique, only that it's special to us. And so the fact that we might be helpful to somebody else is very important to me. In an attempt to be helpful, people will often say to you, well, time heals all wounds. I know they mean very well, but the passage of time alone does not minimize your grief. Grieving the loss of someone you love is a difficult process, and I know Tracy doesn't like the word process, but everyone copes with his grief in their own time and in their own way. I believe that time itself doesn't heal. I think healing comes from within over time. We do not get over someone's death, but we can learn to live with it. Today, I'd like to share some of the ways that my family and I have grieved and learned to live life with renewed hope and purpose since my husband John's death, which was 5.5 years ago today. John was an idealist, but also a realist. When he was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma, he wanted to know his prognosis. The doctor was really reluctant to give him that. He said, I don't like to predict life expectancies because it's just an average. John insisted on knowing. He wanted to know because he's a planner. The doctor said at the time that he would expect that John might live 6 months to a year. John took that as a challenge and said, we're going to beat the averages. And he did. He lived fully. He never retired. And he lived with hope for 5 years following his diagnosis. The primary strategies that I want to share with you today are that you don't take any day for granted, even in your grief. We never know how much time we have and the impact that we're having on other people's lives. And so I think it's important to consider that as we move through our very sad state. You can still choose your attitude, and you can choose the attitude that you will be happy and you can be hopeful, even if it's for the purpose of just being hopeful for other people. You can find joy and you can be grateful every day.
I need to get over.
And very importantly, you remember the past, you live in the present, and you look forward to the future. John often said that things don't happen for a reason. We find a purpose for why things happen. With his diagnosis of cancer, he said right away to his doctor, I want to try every treatment that we can, but if I could be in a clinical trial that you can learn something from my cancer that would be helpful to other people, I would want to do that. All the time that he was being treated, I had a little journal, and I would keep notes as the doctor was telling us about the different treatments that he would have, or if he had a change in prescription or whatever. They helped me to focus and to think about what I would be telling my own children and then our family and friends when we got home. So 5 years I contemporaneously wrote these emails with no intention of ever using the emails. After his death, I reread the emails and it helped me to grieve. It helped me to go through what we were dealing with the entire time. And somehow I just felt almost separated from it. I didn't feel like it was real. It was a roller coaster all over again. So many of the people who had read the emails that we had written over the course of time said that they felt that they were very optimistic and they would be very helpful to other people. So eventually, and it's taken me some time, I did write my very first book, and it was published in May on John's 5th anniversary. The book, Every Day is a Gift, A Couple's Cancer Journey, gave a purpose to my grief and helped me to reinvent myself. Ironically, it was John who always wanted to write after he retired, but he never actually stopped working. So to posthumously honor his goal and to offer his perspective of what it was like to live with cancer and a terminal illness, I included his unedited letters that he had written to his staff. By publishing the book, I fulfilled his wish to write and offer his perspective on living with cancer. I shared our journey of hope with others, and very importantly to me, I have 6 grandchildren, the oldest of whom is now 13, but the youngest is 4. She wasn't even born when John died. But I wanted the very young grandchildren to get to know their grandfather. And so this book has helped me to do that as well. So in the book, I related stories of how we were dealing as a family with cancer. And then after his death, I will be sharing with you some of the stories that I have and how they're coping with his death. There are 2 parts to my presentation today. The first part is going to be very brief, but I think it's very important. And it actually occurred, it was an observation that I made while John was dealing with cancer. And I think they should be considered as best practices for clinicians while they're treating patients with serious illness and impending death. And the reason I wanted to mention this today is because I think in retrospect, these practices have helped me to grieve, knowing that we had done all that we could for John and we have no regrets. And the second part, which is the primary part of the presentation, is examples of how my family confronted grief and continue to find hope and purpose. The sharing examples of my family and that my family and I have confronted our grief and found experiences that were meaningful to us and continue to be meaningful in finding new purpose. So for the first part, when talking to patients, it's critically important that clinicians remember this is a whole person. This is not just a person with a disease. To be respectful of them and to treat them, that they have needs beyond the treatment of the disease. As the disease progresses, keep checking in and listening to the patient in what the family say they need or want. Their needs change over time, and this will help optimize the treatment plan and to live with the consequences. And I can't emphasize enough the need for a coordinated team approach. We never had a situation where we had one doctor telling us one thing and another doctor telling us another. Those discussions happened outside of our office visits, and we felt as though our team had made a decision about how we thought we should move forward at each step of the way, and that was critically important to us. In teaching hospitals, the clinicians really need to be sensitive to the patient's needs, especially when they're serving in the dual role of a clinician and a teacher during an office visit. One of the things that our oncologist was particularly good at was he just made us always feel as though we were the only patients on his schedule during a particular time. We never felt as though we were imposing on him for the time, and we also knew that if he ran late, it was because he was dealing with someone else who had a need that was greater than ours at that particular point in time. It just meant the world to us to feel that important. Obviously, the discussions have to be honest. You want to be clear about what your options are. And our primary nurse said to us at one point, what you hope for changes. Initially, when John was being treated, we hoped that we could eliminate the disease. And then we hoped that perhaps he could stabilize and we would find one more treatment that might extend his life. But then as he got closer to death, you just didn't want him to suffer anymore. So your hopes change over time. Keep asking what the patient's goals are. Don't assume that because you've been dealing with a particular patient for a period of time that the goals remain the same. And also what the caretaker's needs are. I can remember at one point saying to my nurse, I think I really need to have hospice get involved with us now. I don't think the doctor really wanted to give up on John, but I felt as though it was important for me to have that support, that I didn't, it wasn't like I felt like there was no place for me to go. I just felt as though I needed to voice that. So in summary, it's when caretakers and patients and clinicians are having the difficult discussions about a terminal illness. Everyone benefits from optimizing timely, open, and honest communication. This will provide the best possible outcome medically, emotionally, and physical support while the patient is being treated, and it will comfort the family after the patient dies. So now on to the examples of how we coped with grief. As I mentioned in the introduction, everyone grieves differently, and there's no right way to grieve. The following examples of how my family and I learned to cope with John not being physically present and still find hope and new purpose in our lives. In sharing our story, I hope it will inspire others who are faced with chronic illness and death of a loved one to remain open to the signs that are meaningful to you. One of my favorite books, and I read this before John was ever even diagnosed, was Tuesdays with Maury. And in it, Maury, the teacher, says to Mitch, the writer, death ends a life, but it does not end a relationship. That's really powerful because you go on living with that person in your life. It's not the same relationship by them being physically present, but they are in your life and they will always be in your life. We find connections in ways that are unique and meaningful to us and the person who has died. It's important to confront your sadness. Sometimes it's good to do something that you know will make you sad. Do it and then move on to something else. Allow the memories of that special person to become a part of the fabric of your life, but continue to pursue living life fully in the present. Being happy and enjoying life is not disrespectful to the honor or legacy of the person who has died. I know I lost my husband, my sister lost her husband, and we did talk about the fact that at times you felt as though you shouldn't be having a good time, you shouldn't be having a laugh. And both of our husbands were people who enjoyed life and would not want us to be in situations where we didn't feel as though we had the right to be happy. And ultimately, we're each responsible for our own happiness. This brings me to the examples that I shared in the book about how my family and I have felt a new and different presence of John in our lives since his death. It was just hours after John had passed away that we were leaving Mass General Hospital And I had asked the doctor at the time of his death, John had been an organ donor, and I asked him, was there any possibility of any of John's being able to be donated? And the doctor said, no, he was really sorry, but no. So on the ride home from the hospital, my son was driving, and I got a call from the New England Organ Donor Bank asking if I would consider donating John's corneas. I couldn't have been more thrilled. In that moment of extraordinary grief, I couldn't have been more thrilled to think that something of John's would benefit someone else, that someone else would have two people would have the opportunity to have sight, and John, who was a visionary, would have given it to them. I was thrilled. Another story that I'll share that was immediately after his death was my grandson Zachary was 8 years old, and we had been promising him a bicycle all that spring, and we just had never gotten around to getting it for him. His bike, he'd really outgrown his bike, but he had decided that he wanted to participate in the Pan Mass Challenge for kids. So he needed to raise money in order to qualify for a raffle. Well, he did raise the money, and he qualified for the raffle, and he participated and finished the ride. And at the end of the program, a name was drawn. And you guessed it, Zachary's name was drawn. And what do you think he won? A bicycle. And he said to his mother immediately, I didn't think Grandpa would have so much pull so soon. He's outgrown the bike again, and we are now passing that bicycle along to other people in the family, other grandchildren. That summer, we had planned to go to our favorite place in Vermont, the Trapp Family Lodge. We'd been going there for 30 years, and I knew it was going to be a tough trip to get there. But I had decided that I really wanted to take the ride by myself. I typically would go with John, and the kids would meet us there. But I wanted to be able to play the music I wanted to play and to cry if I wanted to cry, and cry I did. But I did arrive feeling as though I was going to enjoy this week with the family. It happened to be a particularly beautiful week weather-wise, but we did see 6 rainbows over the course of the week. And the kids kept saying to me, Grammy, Grandpa's painting the sky for us. He's painting the sky. And I just love these images that the kids had, that and how they could express the fact that they were missing him being there too. And I do notice that the older 2 grandchildren, who were 6 and 8 when John passed away, have the most difficulty in different situations that we find ourselves in, like going back to Vermont. And yet they really want to be there because they feel close to him there. While John was being treated, a receptionist actually gave him a little teddy bear at one point, and she kind of laughed and said, well, you can give this to your grandchildren. And my husband immediately said, no, I'm not giving it to the kids. This is my teddy bear. I'll share it with them. So he put it on his bedside table and left it there. So when the kids would go and visit him, he wasn't often in bed, but when the kids would visit him there, they would ask if they could play with his teddy bear. And he said, of course they could. Well, then after John passed away, the kids would still go and they'd say to me, can I play with Grandpa's teddy bear? Or if they were sleeping overnight, can I sleep with Grandpa's teddy bear? And I obviously would always say yes, but it also served as a great medium for us to be able to have discussions with the kids about John and what they missed most about John not being there. It really was something tangible that allowed us to have conversations. There were stories that I could share so many different times that cardinals were very important to John. He loved them. And so anytime I see a cardinal, I think of him. And I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a cardinal or heard a song right at the right moment when I was either very sad or very happy. It just makes me feel as though there's still that connection. The year before John died, and we didn't realize he was going to pass away that year, we decided to have an early Christmas party for our family because our son lived in North Carolina and he was going to be home for a wedding. So we invited Santa Claus to come to our house and to visit with the children and to have read the night before Christmas. Now, Trenton at the time was only 18 months old, so you figure he's never going to remember this particular activity. And we just had a wonderful time. The kids had a great time. They were very attentive. The books have been very special over the years. All the kids remember which book they got that Christmas from Santa Claus when they bring it out each year. But about 2.5 years after this whole thing, so Trent's now about 4 years old, he came into my house and he looked at the chair that Santa Claus had sat in and he said, "Grammy, Santa Claus sat in that chair." And I looked at him and I said, "What, Trent?" And he said, "Santa Claus sat in that chair." And Grandpa was standing right beside him. I couldn't believe the child remembered that story. And it really warmed my heart to think that it had made such an impact on him. About 2 summers ago, my daughter had wanted to visit John's grave, and she had brought the kids, and her children at this point were 3 and 4. So we had told them what we were going to do and that we would water the flowers and all of that. So we're driving into the cemetery, and the 4-year-old says to us, "Grammy, Grandpa, Santa Claus is buried here." And I looked at him, I said, "What do you mean Santa Claus is buried here?" He said, "Well, there's a sleigh on the stone over there." And I looked over and all I could see was like a spray of flowers on a headstone. I don't know what he was looking at. But anyway, the 3-year-old pipes in right away. She said, "But at Christmas time, he comes back to life and brings us presents." And I thought, how great is that this kid can just make this her world and think so positively. And even now, Benjamin, who was only 5 weeks old when John passed away, will say, "Well, I knew Grandpa." And she'll say, "I didn't know him, but I do know him." And we really love that about that. And we do. We keep pictures up of John around the house, and we will retell stories about him so that hopefully they will feel as though they did know him. Another thing is being able to meet people who know, and I can understand clearly why Tracy felt it was so important to know, to see a counselor who either knew her son or had lost a child, because those relationships are very deep, and there's just something that you share that you can't even explain. But when people will meet me now and tell me a story about some interaction that they had with John, it just means everything to me. So as time progressed, I wanted to be certain that I handled not only the emails while John was being treated, but I thought it was important to talk about how the family was grieving. So in one of my letters, and this was actually the 2nd year after John died, I wrote, "A grieving heart is like a chronic illness. Although the intensity of grief changes with time, bereavement of the loss of a loved one never leaves you. During the 1st year, you hope that one day you'll wake up and feel healed from your broken heart. Over the course of the 2nd year, you're forced to confront the fact that there is no cure. You can continue to hope to feel better, and you know you will because you have had moments of feeling happy, and you know that you will again as you find new reasons for hope and purpose." And a lot of what I'm going to say now is really going to piggyback on both of the previous speakers. The strategies for coping with grief. I do think you have to allow yourself to adjust to your new way of life in a time frame that's appropriate for you. When you feel up to it, I do think that having a daily schedule or a weekly schedule is really important. And planning the anniversaries and the birthdays is a very important aspect of grieving. If you're not already forced into a schedule because you're working or you have family responsibilities, think about including some of these routines. Join a gym class or schedule exercise regularly. I think that's critically important. Volunteer for an organization that really makes you feel as though you're doing something for the benefit of somebody else. Dedicate time to a hobby or an activity that you enjoy and schedule to do it when you feel, when you know you may feel particularly lonely. I found dinner time to be particularly tough, so I signed up for a class that met from 4 to 7. And once I did that at one period of time, then I learned to do things that would keep me busy during that time period, and it did help. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't had my quilting to do during this time. I was given the opportunity to join a bereavement group through Mass General. All of us, there were 10 of us who had lost spouses, and it was a very, very helpful for me. And in fact, our groups, 8 of the 10 still meet about every 2 months. And we've all moved along in our lives, but we have been able to share the ups and downs of our journey. And it's just been a wonderful camaraderie that I've had. I do recommend that you even try out something new that you always thought you might like to do. And then do things that just give you a simple pleasure. I've set up a bird feeder, and I can't tell you how much pleasure I get from that silly bird feeder. Certainly planting flowers. And the other big thing that we talked about a lot in our bereavement group is preparing to go to weddings or social occasions when you're in the situation, and in my case, going alone, and how we're going to handle that, and what exit strategy we're going to have. I'm working on creating some type of a legacy that will memorialize the person in a meaningful way. A scholarship, a park bench, an athletic tournament, an award of recognition, something unique to that person. Every day is a gift. We never know when we wake up in the morning what may happen and who will impact our day by a seemingly small gesture or a kind remark. What we do know is that no day should be wasted on self-pity. Again, from Tuesdays with Maury, the quote, Maury says, "The way you get meaning in your life is to devote yourself to loving others, devote yourself to the community, and devote yourself to something that gives you purpose and meaning," end quote. Life is forever changed. As much as I wish I did not have to grieve his death, I cannot imagine having lived my life without John in it. That would be even sadder. As Maury said, death ends a life, it does not end a relationship. Taking it one day at a time, I've tried to reinvent myself by doing things that make me happy. I know that John would want me to live in the present and be content. Writing the book has given a purpose to grieving John not being physically present in my life. Publishing it has given me an opportunity to connect with others who are forced to share this journey with someone that they know or love. I hope it will inspire readers to pursue their own sources of joy and purpose and not to take any day for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm Annette Quinn, the Support Services Manager for Impact Melanoma, and we're just going to look at the screen here for questions. Are there any questions that we can help to answer from any of the panelists? We'd be happy to do so. You can just type them in. We'll just give it a minute or so. Yeah. Okay, well, it doesn't look like any questions have come in. We just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists, Sue Morris, Tracy Coghram, and Margaret Mcewen for doing such incredible presentations and sharing their insights and their journeys with us today. The beauty of this being a webinar is that this is recorded. So if you know somebody who may have missed it, it will be on our website through Impact Melanoma shortly. Or if you'd like to, view it again, you can certainly do that. And I'm certain that if there are any questions after the symposium that the presenters might be willing to answer those as well. Please keep in mind that your feedback is important to us, and you'll be receiving a post-webinar evaluation. So if you could kindly fill that out and return to us, that would be wonderful. It really helps us to gain an understanding of what you thought about the webinars we offer, and also if you have ideas for some things that we might do in the future. Okay, thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, that was so wonderful, all three of you. I mean, this has been, I'm like very.
Well, it's really interesting to do a presentation where you can see the people.
I know. Do you think in some ways was that easier in some ways, Tracy, just not to have sort of a live audience, or did you find that kind of challenging?
I think I'm a visual person, so I like to see body language.
Right.
But it did help me to, like, I would look at you,
Yes,
so that was helpful for
Okay.
sure. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. I would wonder, I don't know if it's possible, but to have some people in the audience. And then we feel,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. To have
I can
see what that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We could think about that space. Yeah.
Because I know when I do a lot of presentations, like see now, YouTube did this different. I mean, I would walk around and point.
Sure.
Yeah. And so you kind of lose a little bit about that. I felt like it's good. I thought it was still okay to do the power. Right. So
That's as good as I thought.
Normally I would kind of go up to the point, like I would have said.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you kind of lose a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But I think that's what happens.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
You have to give up something in order to get more breath.
Right.
But I agree with you, and I'm even thinking back to a meeting that we had recently at the Barber, and you showed a similar graph when we were talking about change, because of the location issue.
Yeah.
And I remember you actually physically being present with your slide and kind of pointing to and it just made the connection made a little bit more sense. I think the visualization. So that would be great if we could kind of figure that. How was it for you, Margaret?
Well, I've done a number of library presentations, so I have a whole series of slides of the trips that we took. And I just like that opportunity. And so that I can read people. My husband was a superintendent of schools, so he was well known in the community. So we've had a number of people who have come who either worked for him or even parents of kids that he had in school have come to the presentations, and they offer the we still I just find it helpful. I think it obviously helps the people who are participating, because it's not a topic that people will typically go out to a library to hear.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're listening to novelists and things like that. So it's just a way to engage them. But I don't do a book reading with the book at the library talks. But that's why I didn't. Frankly, trying to make sure that you're right on the right slide. Yours is very orderly and neat, but when you're talking kind of contemporaneously with a slide that's showing, then it does add a little bit more stress to giving the presentation. But it's not so formal that you can't.
Yeah.
Well, and the good piece is that we'll be able to use it time after time.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And we can
Yes, and that's great.
And we don't always have that.
Right.
So I think that would be helpful
that's very
as we're trying to make these things available
right
across the country.
Right, right.
This is a kind of cool way of being able to get a message.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also, it could be offered as a resource for the hospice places that you
Yes.
deal with.
Absolutely.
You know?
Anybody can go on, and that's what we love about this.
Right,
Right. Is that we do have that opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long were y'all speaking? Was it an hour and a half?
It's which I think.
It's 20 to 12 now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Deb spoke, so about an hour.
Yeah, because you had about 5 minutes, Deb, and then everyone. Yeah.
I had no idea how long mine was going to take.
Yeah.
It could take 10 minutes or it could take 2 hours.
Right.
know.
Yeah.
But I think it was perfect. Yeah, I mean, people said what they needed to say.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, no,
I
there wasn't,
love-
I didn't feel rushed.
I love the way that you were able to sort of that's
It's
Kind of
yeah,
yeah,
it was great.
Well,
Well,
we
so
started
it's
talking,
interesting.
like, oh, they're gonna hear this more than once.
That's how we learn.
Right.
Right.
You never just say something once.
But that's interesting because from a clinical perspective to kind of lay out, what that process looks like. But, and then have you both kind of
Right.
share in some of that experience. I mean, it tied together so nicely.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
so congruent. It was,
Yeah.
really just beautifully done.
Yeah,
So-
that was great.
You had thought that we would hit that
I
button.
I know. Were you planning behind the scenes?
Yeah.
People can see you still on
People can see. All set.
Okay, thank you so
that.
much.
Thank
We're
you,
so
thank
appreciative.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We can take care of our family. We just check it or however maybe even just send to get them.
No, let me see.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm on the book. You want to, okay.
So,
I'm on book. You're on book. We can come around there and get my notes.
Here it is.
So Tracy, have you been, sorry, keep yawning now, are you doing many presentations, many speaking engagements for that?
I think the first 2 or 3 years I was doing a whole lot. And since, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 a year, I'm not opposed to it. That year between the second year was really,
No, hard.
it was a hard year for me. And I just didn't want to talk about it anymore. I had just gotten, I mean, that was just a weird year that year. Maybe it was the year between 2 and 3, I can't remember. But I'm kind of back where I can do it, but I can never do it without crying, and I've just accepted that.
I think what you said was perfect.
Yeah,
Because
right.
it's the human
Normalizes
element
the-
of it. It's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
this is this is what happens. I'm always saying, I have a joke with my group, that if anyone apologizes for crying,
Yeah.
I've got one day when I actually do one of the jokes, I've got an imaginary bucket there that you've got to donate $1 to the program. But one day I think I'm going to actually have something there that if you apologize for crying, you're going to put your money in.
Yeah, that's right. Well, for me, crying is hard because it's something that I never would do in front of people before Connor died, but now it doesn't matter who you are. It's just, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And that's what I meant when I said I've lost friends. So now my group of friends are the people who can handle it if we're having wine and I break down and cry, or,
And that was perfect, I thought, because that's a very common thing that it happens. And she goes, oh gosh, I should have said that, I should have said that, but I would have been here for like a week.
Yeah.
That we often talk about that, the people who support someone through the illness are often not the same.
No, definitely not.
It requires different skills, and I think it gets back to the fixing.
Yeah.
And who feels hopeless and
Yeah.
can't fix you. But I thought,
And John had 2 professional friends that, they have a one professional friend who has a particularly hard time seeing me now. And I know he cares about me, but they just had such a wonderful relationship that and it's not that I think that he doesn't think of John otherwise. I know he does. It's just, it's harder. Yeah, very hard for him. But as time goes along, I found, it's funny how people will say to you, they don't want to bring up the person's name. It's like, they don't want to upset you. Like, they don't want to bring you.
well, people say that to me when I teach. I say, don't you think they're already?
They're already,
Yeah. That's right.
thinking about this. This is not something that's true. No, I don't know. It's just funny. But
Thank you for doing what you do.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for
We
doing what you
feel
do.
like to kind of share, we certainly have you know, and sometimes we've had like quiet requests. Like, do you think, you know, there's certainly like a call for it. There's certainly a need. People are kind of hungry to have, you know, to hear from people who have had shared experiences. Really, they need it, and they need to kind of feel included in the world of bereavement. You know, so
because you do feel like you're going crazy. You
Yeah.
feel like you're totally.
Well, it's almost
nuts.
like a mental illness that, you know, you're kind of embarrassed that you feel the way you do. And you know that you have a right to it, but,
Right.
but it's just not discussed.
Yeah.
Well, it is now nationally, so
I
good
know.
work. Thank you for opening that up.
Did you see the number on the computer, Deb?
I did.
So I saw, so that number that was there, that was indicative of how many people,
Yes.
which is interesting because it doesn't coincide with the number of WUFU applications.
Right, and I think they just did not get picked up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
because I had 22, but then I saw 42 on the screen.
Yeah, I think we probably had more than.
Okay, but they wouldn't have.
They have registered. It might not have registered. They might not have registered.
Interesting.
It's disconnected.
Yeah.
Yeah. It keeps saying people can see you. I'm going to
They
close
can't.
this.
They can't see us anymore. We don't want them to see us anymore.
So
Well,
Tracy,
thank
I
you.
don't know if you'd ever be, I know you're on the page, but what I'm thinking about that after I was listening to you is that one of the things I'm trying to do as Dana Father is do a bereaved conference for bereaved parents.
Mhm.
And like last year we did a bereaved one for bereaved spouses, but this is a bit more on the pediatric side. And you know, I'd like to get a speaker like that. We got a few guest speakers last year, so we might have enough money. I don't know whether that would be
Yeah, I'll do it. What time of year is it?
I don't know, we probably do it in the spring.
Okay, just don't do it. I couldn't join between about April 24th to May 10th. I'm running the London Marathon.
Oh, really?
I have to have a goal.
London is a good one.
It'll be a fun day.
Anyway, so I think we've got the email.
Oh, yeah.
It's just that I think for parents, it's, you know, you want to have somebody who's obviously been through about doing it kind of in a healthy way, you know, that you can role model what we think people are.
Well, that's why I started sharing my, and I can share some other things too, but my martini episode, because, you know, people look at me and say, oh my gosh, you're handling it so well, but they only see this part.
Yeah,
You know, Scott saw the martini thing and it wasn't pretty.
No. Expensive.
Through the whole 3 weeks of
He was
it.
always buying the good stuff.
If you're gonna drink a martini, I have to get the good stuff. Through the whole 3 weeks, Scott, God love him, never said a word. He never said a word. And then at the end of it, when I finally, you know, stopped doing it, I said, were you getting worried about me? He goes, well, a little bit. Had it gone on much longer, it would have been an intervention.
Intervention time, yes.
So those are important things.
No, but I think there are things that we don't speak enough about. You know, I think that everyone, you know, there's nothing in our society that defines people as grieving now, and that, you know, you see you on the street, and that you on the street and not knew who you were, then you wouldn't have a clue, right?
Right.
And I think it's helpful for people to hear that they, you know, sometimes you can make a choice that's not going to be healthy in the long term.
Yeah.
You know, it's just to be able to recognize.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and good luck with your book, Margaret.
It's wonderful. I've read it.
Your local thing.
Yeah, I'm local, yeah. No, and what I did want to do, try to get it into at least the cancer resource centers at the different hospitals. And so if you could give a call to them. I tried to get in touch with all of them, and I've got it now. They're actually selling it at Israel.
Are you kidding?
And after Christmas, they'll take it Mass General.
Oh, excellent.
So that's where I really envisioned it being,
We do sell them. So in the farmer, they have like 3 different things. There's a gift shop, which sells, I don't know, I haven't been there in years, but it's things. And then they have the Blum Center, so it's for patient education. But that's more about,
Yeah, sometimes there's like term sheets.
Well, it's just,
But then
yeah,
there's the
it's
friends
just, what's
sheet
hard,
as
what I
well.
have learned is that it's better to have a contact name or a person who can just say,
Sure.
this is for,
Yeah.
you know, the purposes of your patients or whatever. But to be able to have a connection with somebody
Well,
rather than just sending
really
an
important.
email.
And-
Because I've got supporting materials about, you know, how you can order it and all of that, but it's just like, what she did
Is
is.
it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon and it's on Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, like the fact, I mean, you know, I get sent books from time to time, and I mean, I wouldn't put anything anywhere unless I've actually read it. And think it's
Sure, yeah.
helpful. The fact that I've read it also is helpful, so,
Right, right.
it's, you know, so that I'll ask, and if they want to contact you, can I just give them your email?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I think Friends would be the best place, because that's the place that sells the books. So they're gonna, Friends Boutique is
Oh, right,
next
next
to
to
the, right next to,
Wow.
yeah, so because the rest are just volunteers, so I think that there's more of a managerial role in the Fed and the Friends, I would start there, yeah.
It's awesome. That would be great. That, I'll try to give you that, and I could just give them that. My email address is right.
You have that electronically.
I do.
If you'll send that to me electronically, I can talk to some folks at UCSF.
Okay, do I have her?
Yeah, we're all on
Yeah,
the
we're
same.
all right, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'll send you an email today and ask for it. and just-
Perfect, yeah, no, I have that electronically. My fear was that, you know how you just delete or toss out things, and I just said, this kind of, you could keep yourself very busy, but not really be terribly productive, but
Yeah.
rather have a few connections and
Yeah.
have it really
Oh, it'll
there.
probably take some time, I know.
Oh, it will.
I book some, like,
Yeah, we'll put it on when we
put the
webinar.
webinar.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
and you were very kind to even include it in the biography, but it's just, I know that it's one of those things, it's not gonna be in Barnes and Noble across the street, that's not where it's gonna be, it's because that's not the audience.
Yeah, right.
But I still have to reach out to the hospice.
You should try the
people.
National Hospice Organization.
Yeah, the National
Yeah.
Hospice, that would be helpful.
They're really good.
Yeah, I'll have to get that.
So I have a contact name for I think he's the director of communications, and that's where I got information to post the flyer. So I don't know if he would be the right person.
Okay.
But if I send you him, you know, he might be able to.
Oh, well, yeah, if you would do that, that would be great.
Yeah.
It was funny because Todd Reinhardt had my bereavement counselor, said that he had seen the webinar was advertised. It
Yes,
prompted him to do something that,
yeah.
it was just funny because he had promised me something he had got to send it, so it prompted me.
Well, it makes me, I mean, it's just way life is way too easy, but what you just reminded me is because I actually was in London in August and was talking to my publisher there, and they said, well, can you get your book in at the National Hospice? And I said, sure, I'll do that. I'll ask them whether they might review it, or because I've not done it. They haven't. Oh, no, I haven't done it. Oh, you haven't?
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
don't, I mean, it's like,
It's like a one more thing.
There's always another thing.
Well, I did contact the Cancer Society. This was very interesting to me. I didn't realize that with the Cancer Society, I was really just kind of putting out feelers. And they said that unless they saw it in manuscript form, they would not recommend it. And I didn't know that.
Why is that?
Because they want to have read it and approved it before they would make the recommendation for it. And they wanted it in manuscript form.
Why is that?
I don't know. That's what they told me.
They're a little old school.
Yeah, a little old school.
Someone's phone's up there.
That's mine. So, you live and
Thank you
learn.
for this opportunity.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so it's so
everybody.
glad to meet you, Sue. I'm delighted. Yeah.
After all your back and forth and everything.
Are we staying in this room, right?
Yeah, we're moving.
Okay.
Moving.
That's nice.
But not till 2, so we have till 2.
Okay.
We have till 2. I have to go find the post office.
And then what, are we on our own for lunch? Should we go grab lunch?
Yeah, I think Lori might be here.
Oh, yay.
I gotta find out where everybody is. Now, Tracy, I was texting with Tracy because she was listening to the webinar from the office.
Yeah.
She said, she texted me and said, I can hear Lori in the background. I'm like, I don't know how you can hear Lori in the background because she's not here. That was weird.
That's
I
what
know
I
what
was
you're
talking about, yeah.
We went on to it.
No.
No, exactly. And then she said, I hear someone coughing. There was nobody
Oh my gosh,
coughing.
is she in the right room?
Yeah, she was listening.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's funny.
Yeah, we were, if I was pushing getting.
So what Lori said is, I'm here, great symposium, I listened on my way down.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna find the ladies' room.
Yeah.
Well, so what are we gonna do then? Are we gonna, I assume that means we're going outside.
Are we going outside?
We have to, I think.
Because
We
there's
just
no-
go across the street, yeah.
Into the mall,
What's your accent?
California,
It sounds different.
Northern California.
I'm trying to work out all my accents.
We
Where
don't
do I
have,
sound
we
like?
don't have one in Northern California. That's what I'm told. No.
He does enunciate though, so that's probably right.
No, you're fine.
He doesn't live in Boston.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
All
I
right.
was acknowledged on this one.
Yeah.
Nice meeting all of you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
I know you.
All right, good luck.
Thank you.
Tracy, nice to meet you later. We're gonna see you next week. Next week. Okay, great meeting you. You'll be in touch.
Appreciate the story and hearing that part.
Thank you.
Very, very neat.
Nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you.
All right.
Bye. Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Take care, Margaret. We'll
Okay,
see you
take
soon.
care.
Take care.
Good luck tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna need codes then,
Yes, there are codes.
even if we just go across to the.
Yeah. So I'm gonna run the package. We're gonna go quick wrap on the post and we're gonna jam it. Thank you.
Great.
And.
Yeah.
Yeah.